I think the role of any good intellectual festival, many festivals are there to entertain. A literature festival, by the very nature of its beast, must inform citizenry. A man and a boy came through the Haveli gate and he said, I sleep up ahead on the road and I know that I'll never be able to send my son to school. But I thought that if he heard a story, it would change his life forever. And I hear that you tell stories and therefore I've come.
Civilizations over ages have developed their own architecture for gathering people. Temples gathered believers, universities gathered scholars, markets gathered buyers. What in your mind is a literary festival gathering that those older institutions cannot anymore?
I don't think it's about being in competition with some of these institutions. I think the primary role of any literary gathering, be it a literature festival or be it a book release or any other system, is really bringing people together who understand and perhaps are curious about wanting to know more about books and ideas, beliefs and systems, processes and innovation. And it's really about the progress of a society. Any society that needs to progress needs to allow for larger contribution of writers and thinkers who will bring together this idea of progress through socio-political, religious, and other discourse, and that's vital.
A curator works with an unusual material. It's not stone or paint or not even language. It's attention. Have you come to believe that attention itself is becoming a rarest form of cultural resource?
Yes, absolutely. With the advent of social media and our somewhat proclivity to have or subscribe to ADHD and the fact that we are always on this doom scroll where attention goes to what's trending at the moment or what's interesting at the moment. The more long form idea of deep dive, be it academic publishing or be it, regular publishing, that is at risk to some extent. But having said that, even if you're able to encapsulate in bite-sized pieces some of the ideas in these deep dive books, I think that can become a hook for somebody to want to read more or to learn more. What I think the purpose in all of this is can we inculcate the idea of being inquisitive, the idea of asking questions? In the past, at least when we were in school, if you asked a question that was perhaps outside of the prescribed format, you were asked, told to keep quiet. Or if you asked your parents questions beyond a particular point, you were asked to shut up after a period. So we keep trying to shut down people who ask uncomfortable questions. And we as a society need to encourage our young people and not so young people to ask vital questions. If we have to grow into an innovative economy, which we have to, given the advent of AI, etc., then you need to be creative. You need to be able to think outside of the box. And to be able to think outside of the box, you need to be able to ask questions freely and without fear.
I'll take that forward, and instead of questions, I'll peg my next question on conversations. So most people leave a festival remembering a conversation, but I wonder that deeper work happens in the conversations they never have. How much of curation is designed around absence?
So let me answer that a little differently. A lot of the experience that people have when they come to a festival like the Jaipur Literature Festival, because of its scale, its size, its color, it's an experiential place. And the magic that takes over people is partly by the speakers who are on the stage, partly by the audience who are participants, but it's in really that space in between the speakers on stage and the audience. That's where magic happens. And many of the folks who visited the festival have, by and large, always come back to say that, yes, they take away with them these great conversations, but at the end of the day, the experience of being able to have a conversation with somebody who you don't know, who's sitting next to you, or at breakfast the next morning, or in the bus going back, etc. That's where these conversations and ideas fructify. It's an exchange. It's a place of exchange. So our role primary is not to curate that aspect, because we believe that by making this accessible to everybody, by allowing free access, you could be sitting next to a Nobel laureate or a Vikram Seth or whoever on the front lawns or in any of the venues. And that's the magic of it, that you start a conversation based on what you have heard. Our idea is not that we are propagating a particular viewpoint or a particular ideology. The Jaipur Literature Festival, in its broadest sense, is a platform for varied ideas, for varied thoughts, etc. And it's for the audiences then to say that, yes, we buy into it or we don't, we disagree or agree, we want to have a sense of dissent or argument. And if they really want to do much more of a deep dive, they then go and buy the book. And in sort of upnowing the book or making the book part of their experience, they can then take that forward. Absence of conversation, as you describe it, it's, I think, more than absence, it's silence today that's equally important, because where and when do you have that me time to process some of the ideas that you have picked up? And one of the criticisms that we get is that there is really, it's a feast. You have 6 different sessions every hour on the hour, starting from 9 to 7, and then music, etc. So it's an overload to your senses. So some people then choose to withdraw, and then we have our lounges and other spaces that you can withdraw to pretty much, and then try and process what you have. A very eminent banker, Piyush Gupta, who used to head up DBS, I remember he once said to me, he said, Sanjoy, I come here, but I take away enough ideas for the rest of the year, and that's what I'm able to process.
You're talking about people having a free space. I'll come to taste now. Taste is quite often mistaken for preference, but historically, if you look, taste is also an instrument of power. Who really decides what is worthy of public attention?
Well, in the broadest sense, if you look at the news channels today, or people who think that they're part of the news or the public discourse, they control a lot of what goes out. We know that social media influencers today rule the other part of the roost, and it's their choice that we are seeing more and more on our feed. But in many ways, influencers, yes, can maybe sell a product or sell an idea, but you need the other side to be able to take this on board. And I still believe that if you travel enough, if you read enough, if you're open enough, then you are open to the idea of ideas. Otherwise, the syndrome is a frog in a well. You only know that well, and you try and climb out of it, or a crab in a well, and the crab is trying to pull you. The other crabs are trying to pull you back in. So this is a cyclical experience. And yes, the gatekeepers of knowledge, the gatekeepers of news, the gatekeepers of public understanding and thought, gatekeepers of education, gatekeepers of everything that influences us, all of these gatekeepers work, mostly at least in democratic countries, within that principle. When you look at other societies, say Singapore, China, or Russia, or Turkey, then of course there's restrictions of what you can or what you cannot think and how do you articulate that, because everything has to go towards a particular narrative. Now that's one way of furthering socio-economic development, as is the Singapore model, which China then chose to follow and became the Chinese model, which has been equally successful. I think the jury is out on the Russian or the communist model in present times. But again, it's really the idea of gatekeeping. So who becomes these gatekeepers, and how do you then protect or open it up? I mean, for us at the Jaipur Literature Festival, because Namita does all of the Indian languages and all of the Indian programming. William does all of the international programming, with a large focus on history, because that's obviously his area. I do the math and the philosophy and the non-fiction part of it, the sciences, etc. Because our effort is, can we bring the arts and the sciences together in some way? So we have a lot of space for everything from environment to Palestine to the wars, to the forgotten wars around, etc. But also travel and food and philosophy and music and film and literature and poetry and theater and all of this other world that, So in that sense, it's all sort of all comes together by our colleagues in programming, Kritika and Neha and their colleagues, who then try and pull this together as strands. So in this case, it's not A person or B person as a gatekeeper. And then we work very closely with all of the publishing houses. They pitch to us, and then of course it has to fit into our programming needs. We don't necessarily take in submissions. We're not a submission-oriented festival. And we're not a festival driven by, if you give us money, we'll take your book or we'll take your stuff. So it really has to fit into this larger idea. And I think that's one of the reasons why our festivals have been successful, not just in India, but across the world.
Every program is also about omission. Do you remember your exclusions more vividly than your invitations?
Well, yes and no. If somebody is, keeps writing to us and trying to persuade us to take a piece of work on board, and we are unable to do so for various reasons. I mean, in the early years, we used to steer clear of self-publishing, for example. Today we don't, because we know that self-publishing is here to stay. But we do still steer clear of, say, self-help books, which of course is hugely popular. It's one of the fastest selling genres today in the world. But we steer clear of it because self-help books are of a particular kind. What we try and do much more, because we have a responsibility and a possibility of, is what we try and do really is, can we do deep dive in academic writing? In Jaipur Literature Festival and the JLFs across the world, the good thing is we don't necessarily have to worry about people coming through the door. People come. And our effort is, whether you come for A talk or B talk, the pizza or the music, the chart or the art, if you stumble upon an idea which changes your mindset, that's the reason why we do what we do. And, I'll close it with a story. So in our fourth year, when we had invited Oprah Winfrey to the festival, we had put into place security for the first time. And I receive people for an hour every day in the morning, because I feel that people should come into a recognizable face rather than come into this vast nothingness of a public space. And a man and a boy came through the Haveli gate, and because I was there, they were stopped because they looked like they didn't belong. And because I was there, I walked up and I said, "Kya baat hai bhaiya, can I help you?" And he said, "I sleep up ahead on the road on the pavement opposite SMS Hospital. And I know that I'll never be able to send my son to school, nor be able to afford to buy him a book. But I thought that if he heard a story, it would change his life forever." and I hear that you tell stories, and therefore I've come. And he turned to go, and I said, no, this is for you. And it was for us the first time that we felt that we had been successful in turning the festival from a festival for people like us to a festival that was much more inclusive and much more open and accessible to everybody, because we understand the power of a story and the ability of a story to be able to change a mindset or form an idea or be the foundation for thinking, thought, and the evolution of societies.
There can't be a better event for a startup, than this story, this kind of a story. Coming back again to curation, there is a certain violence about curation. To choose one voice also means to deny another the same space. Does that responsibility become heavier with time or lighter for you?
It is a huge responsibility, and we're very conscious of it when we say yes or no. Or the interesting thing is, because we program by theme or by sessions, So, for example, I was in Agra yesterday, day before yesterday, for a talk on my book, and I met a surgeon, a micro whatever surgeon who works on hands. And he presented me his book, out of the blue. And I started reading it on my journey back, and it was so it was so relevant. And at the same time, when I was in Bombay for a talk, I met another doctor, Mazda, who's a brain surgeon. And again, he talks about, surgery and what it does to people, etc. So here there's a match in a theme, in a session where you can have both these surgeons coming together with other doctors to be able to talk about a similar thing. So there's the accident of discovery at some level. And then there's obviously, because there's so many festivals across the country, about 200 odd, and about 300 odd festivals have taken some kind of, thought or process from what we've done at Jaipur. We're very conscious that we must continue to be a place of inclusive thought and writing. So for us, it's not necessarily only to look at the big names or only to look at popular genres. We may do so irrespective, but for us, it's much more of a responsibility to look at that larger other space. 65 or 70% of our programming today is non-fiction. But in the fiction thing, we try and ensure that there's crime fiction, there's popular fiction, perhaps less of that, because we do believe that many other festivals have a space for that much more than perhaps we do. And our responsibility really is for those works that may not find a space because of the kind of writing or the kind of ideas that it presents. And for us, it's also about, what is it that we need to be reflective of? What is it that's happening around the world or in that city or in that place? And what is it that our primary responsibility is? So issues around environment, around water, around violence, around hatred, around migration, around socio-religious issues, around economics, all of this finds primary space in our programming, apart from, the more popular genres of history and travel and fiction and poetry, etc.
Yeah, speaking of it, accessibility, public culture celebrates accessibility, but it's that difficulty that is at the center of serious art. How do you protect difficulty without becoming exclusionary?
Very difficult. I mean, it's always a challenge. It's not an easy thing to do. As you rightly said, by choosing A and not choosing B, you are excluding A or B thought. At the end of the day, we have only X number of sessions in Y number of days in Z number of spaces. So that's the parameters within which we can operate. But for us, the advantage is that we've got 15 other editions. So we are able to deep dive into American literature or Latino writing or Spanish writing. We've got a Spanish edition. Or earlier this year, we did 4 new editions in Ireland where we looked at traveling between 2 international boundaries between Northern Ireland and Ireland. And we looked at, say, the idea of reconciliation or bringing these 2 different or segregated places together. It would be the same in terms of doing a festival that travels from Pakistan and crosses Lahore or to the other side into India and continues. But obviously we can't do that. But in Ireland, we could do that. And it was very, very impactful. And we did a series of conversations around the for and against of reconciliation or integration. And it was very interesting that we had Sam McBride and Fintan O'Toole, who both wrote about this, argue on both sides of the divide with different moderators, so that we could broad base the conversation. And, the amazing thing was that every conversation that happened in these 3 cities, which is Belfast, which is in Northern Ireland, in Armagh, which is a spiritual capital, which hosts both the Catholic church as well as the Reformist church, and then in Dublin. Each of these conversations were different. Each of them were fully and well attended, and each of the moderators brought a different perspective to it. That's what it's about, different perspectives. So we try and ensure that, keeping in mind, as you said, this idea that at the end of the day, there is a sense of exclusion, but we can't be everything to everyone. We have to be very clear what we are. And like I said, we're not a general public submission festival. We don't work on those factors at all. We're a very curated, specifically curated festival, where we're very clear what our responsibility is and perhaps what is the need of the moment at that point. What can we start thinking about for the future? Because everything finally, as far as we're concerned, also looks at the idea of this one planet being our collective home. And it doesn't matter whether the bomb is being thrown 3,000 miles away or 2,000 miles away or wherever. Every bomb thrown somewhere on the planet is impacting each and every one of us. And therefore, each and every one of us has a responsibility to the well-being and safety of the rest of the polity.
The way you've been talking about the festival, year after year, we see more people at your core festival in Jaipur. But I've also seen that participation is being confused for engagement. A room can be full, but still it can be intellectually empty. How do you sense whether genuine conversation is taking place?
I don't think our role is to in any way censor or sense whether a conversation is taking place. That's not our role. That's really for the people who come there. If they want to deep dive into it or they want to be part of an exchange or an understanding, well, that's their responsibility. That's their choice. Finally, it's about choice. And as you rightly said, today, because we've sort of started filtering and we have a charge now of whatever 100 rupees for young people, etc. Our effort has always been, can we bring kids through the door? And I think 67% of our audience is below the age of 25, which is quite exceptional for any literature gathering. So that's amazing. But do we then ensure that they are like in a classroom listening and taking in everything? No, we can't, and that's not our responsibility. As I said, our hope is that come to the festival for whatever reason you're coming. Your teacher has brought you, your school has sent you, or you've come, like I said, for a date night or pizza or a chart or whatever. But as long as you stumble upon an idea and perhaps that changes your life. And again, recently I met somebody in Dubai, in the UAE. And she was telling me that she had come to a session with Priyambada Natarajan from Yale, who was talking about particle physics and black hole and everything that the Hubble telescope program has been sending in. And she said, I was so fascinated by what I heard that I used to stand on the top of my house and look out into the stars thinking what this must be, this ever expanding universe at, 600 miles per second or whatever as it expanded, or 6,000 miles. And she said that fascinated me, and I took to looking at the sciences. And now she's part of a program that looks at, space and so on and so forth. So I think that's really, for us, the impact that young people have. Should everybody who comes through the door sit and listen attentively and be engaged with whatever? That's their choice, not for us to dictate.
So then, do festivals still create citizens or merely audiences?
I think the role of any good intellectual festival, and you don't have to, all festivals don't necessarily have to do that. Many festivals are there to entertain. Religious festivals are there for other reasons. The Durga Pujas and Ganesh Chaturdis, remember, were created as nationalist movements to take the idea of the puja outside of the house and bring together communities, etc. So I don't think that's necessarily the responsibility of creating good citizens. But what I do think that a literature festival, by the very nature of its beast, must inform citizenry. Whether it leads to creating better or good citizens, that's again not the responsibility of the festival. What the festival must do is create a platform of equal opportunity, equal voices.
So civilizations are remembered not just because of what they created, but mostly because of what they chose to preserve. Festivals. Do festivals archive the present, or they simply accelerate its forgetting?
Again, a complex question. So just going back to the idea of civilizations, remember, civilizations very rarely set out to preserve. As more and more archaeological sites are uncovered, whether in Turkey or Stonehenge or across India, etc., or in Pompeii, which was lost because of the explosion of Mount Vesuvius. What has preserved and the way we understand civilizations today is through its art and through its literature. So if it hadn't been for the Rosetta Stone and its discovery, you'd still have much of Egyptian hieroglyphics lost in translation, and you wouldn't know what all these great kings of Egypt stood for. Similarly, in the Harappan tradition, we still don't understand the Harappan script, and therefore the Harappan tradition per se, outside of the archaeological findings, is somewhat lost to us. What remains in terms of whether it's the cave paintings in Uluru in Australia dating back 50,000 years, or those in Bhimbetka ranging between 10,000 and 75,000 years, that's what remains, the scratchings of these hunter-gatherers in spaces which you're now learning about through their art. So while we pay lip service to our great civilization and art, we give it very little space, either officially or otherwise. And therefore, again, places like literature festivals, really, it's not about accelerating, and it's really about deep dive. And that is what we see our role as. We also see our role as being reflective of some of the traumas that we see around us. As I said, the forgotten wars, the genocide that continues in Gaza, what's happening to women in Afghanistan, or what's happening in Africa, in the Congo and the Sudan and in Lebanon, but also what's happening in and around India and in our neighborhood. Are we helping accelerate change? Not necessarily. Do books accelerate change? Not necessarily. What books do is allow you to understand the past. Perhaps by doing so, make sense of the present. Because if you disconnect history in the past, you're not going to be able to understand events of the present. And then perhaps look at envisioning a better tomorrow. None of these are necessarily in the same way because you keep going back and forth. Sadly, most people in power rarely read history, so they don't understand that history tends to repeat itself again and again and again. And that's primarily because of the collusion of ego, power, money, and the idea of the nation or the idea of power. And I think that is what needs to be challenged. So who challenges that? Primarily writers. Writers don't necessarily only write to entertain. Writers write because they have a volition to write, because they have something to share from within that's wanting to burst upon the larger audience. And then it's for the audience really to reach out and take that on board and to buy that book. Literature festivals can only be a platform which is sort of like scratchings. You scratch the surface and then you must enthuse people to be able or to want to know more, to question. And therefore in questioning, like in any academic research, you go out and read more and more and more to be able to come up with your own theory or your own rationale. That's the process. We are not necessarily the solution, and that's not what any festival can claim to be or position itself to be.
You talked about serious art and intellectual art, and beauty is something that lies at the center of art or any good writing. But beauty has become oddly suspect, as I see it, in contemporary intellectual life. People trust relevance more than beauty now. Do you think we've lost confidence in beauty as a public value?
So again, just to sort of course correct that, art in its most base form. So if you look at, again, I referred to Uluru in Australia and Bhimbetka. I wouldn't necessarily say that art is beautiful. That art was insightful. The art in its own way, or the stick figures or the worldly, etc. Some of it is stunning and astonishing, but not all of it is beautiful. Art doesn't have to necessarily be beautiful or aesthetic to be form great art. People would question if Sidney Pollock's abstractions were great art. What is great about Sidney Pollock's abstractions is that if you view the art from a distance and as you appear closer to it, it's the perspective, the fractals there ensure that what you see from a distance, even as you zoom in, you're roughly seeing the same thing. So, different art is processed in different ways, which is really, I think, the beauty of any art. And as they say, beauty lies in the eyes of the beholder. I think today there's a much more conscious effort, whether it's in fashion or in art, etc., to be very conscious of how you place beauty in the sense that we understand, beauty at the heart of something. I think more importantly, what we should look at is aesthetics and design in that concept of beauty. And one of the things that I've been arguing with across state governments and governments across the world is that aesthetics and design should be something that you start learning pretty much at the kindergarten level, because it's something that's at the base of everything that we know and understand. Sadly, we tend to only look at studying aesthetics and design post graduation, which is too late. If you have to look at the idea of beauty, look at nature. If you have to look at math, look at nature. Everything is ordered, the branches of a tree to its trunk, which if you look at the Vitruvian Man by Leonardo da Vinci, you will see the same basis as you see, in nature. If you look at a leaf or a tree or a stalk or a flower, why is a flower in its form? Why is it so specific in its geometrical patterns? Because bees are blind and they can only understand a pattern. So flowers evolved into that. So the very basis of beauty lies in nature. And from nature, we can look at how do we. So if you destroy nature, coming back to the idea of destruction, every time you destroy nature, you cut a tree, you throw a bomb, you destroy the beauty around us. You are destroying the idea of beauty, which is not something that we created. Man did not create nature. From nature, man evolved. And I think we need to be conscious of our place in the scheme of things.
I'll come to markets. Markets are excellent at measuring demand, but culture protects what has no measurable demand. Can institutions afford to defend the unnecessary?
Different institutions play different roles, and I think it needs to start from there. Sadly, today, most institutions, not just here, but across the world, have mortgaged themselves to the idea of demand and supply. And more importantly, not necessarily only to demand, but the economics of demand. And therefore, whether you look at education institutions and what they offer is equal to who wants to study what or what is sexy at that point of time. And these are really problematic spaces. When we started the Jaipur Literature Festival, if we did a dipstick survey then 21 years ago, people would have laughed at the idea that amongst the world's largest festivals would have a space in Jaipur in Rajasthan. And Harvard Business School, while it teaches its case study on us, said we had a 5-year and a 10-year and a 15-year plan. Not necessarily. Much of it happened by accident. And so to some extent, you have to create demand. If you look at forever, people keep saying that theater is in decline. I mean, this is not today. It's across millennia that people have said, theater is declining. Yet people have continued to go to spaces. Similarly with dance, yesterday I went to see at the India Habitat Center, and I was so delighted that I could actually pay for a ticket for dance, and the space was full. For too long have we left it to the doorkeepers, the earlier Maharajas and the Zamindars and the later people in power to be able to control and create spaces for this kind of culture. Culture today has been democratized, as we're seeing. If you look at the ideas of, say, Durga Puja and Ganesh Chaturthi and Onam and everything that goes around it, you're seeing more and more these to be socio-economic religious efforts that are happening. And you're seeing these to be democratized in completely different ways. And that's really the nature of the beast. So what is it that we need to do today? You just need to ensure that everybody has some kind of access. What is it that in North India, the street corner Ram Leela did? It gave you access. What then happened from that? It went to Doordarshan with, the great Ramayana and then Mahabharata, etc., which has then created this demand today for more temples, etc., which has its own, as you know, issues. So you have to be conscious that when you're creating demand, with it comes a whole series of issues that you need to also be very conscious of. So today when we're looking at, say, recyclable fashion, and you're creating a demand there. So at the end of the day, where is this recycling coming from? What's the end use of that fabric? What do you do with fabric? What's the kind of fabric you're using? If it's khadi and hand woven and hand, what's the capacity of that? And therefore, then what's the capacity of the mills? And then what are the capacity of the larger factories? These are all complex, complicated questions without necessarily a simple solution of this is demand and therefore, that's the supply, and therefore what is the demand and supply within the art. Look at traditional art today in India. I mean, Australia came into its own about 25, 30 years ago with Aboriginal art being celebrated and finding focus. Today in India, yes, of course, the Madhubani styles or the Warli styles or all of these other traditional tribal art forms are coming into its own. But it's taken time and it's taken an effort by people like Anubhav Nath, One-EQ, Ojas Art, etc., who focused on this as opposed to, contemporary or Bengal school or the Bhopal school or the progressive Bombay School of Art or decorative art. So again, it's a thing of who gets behind what and how do you create value, and does that value stand up to scrutiny?
Now I'll come to the private Sanjoy Roy. What conviction have you slowly abandoned in the last, say, 20 years?
What have I abandoned? Well, one of the things I've become more conscious of is how I represent myself on social media. Earlier, I used to be fairly rabid and used to be, pushing the idea of a much more democratic, integrated, casteless solution of equity and equality. Today, I'm much more conscious of that. So whereas earlier I had to 10 tweets on, say, what's happening in Jantar Mantar, today I would consciously do 2 because I'm aware of, what I have to also protect. These are consciously you have to edit. I've also abandoned the idea, when I was in university and I used to be an activist, and much of my life was spent in on the streets, either in street theater, talking about issues like bright burning or dowry or inequity or caste issues, etc. And really being on the street. So today, in many ways, I'm not on the street, but what I am is on much larger platforms with perhaps a much greater potential of being able to reach out to people. So what I've abandoned is the grandstanding, of that, Narabazi is going to bring about change. Of course, Narabazi has a role, but there's many other roles that I have to be very conscious of. So that certainly has been put by the wayside.
When was the last time you changed your mind because of a conversation?
Just day before yesterday, somebody came and Raghav had come and spoken to me. It happened in a coincidental way. I woke up in the morning with the idea that I had to send a message to a friend of mine who had some legal cases going on about Ma Kamakhya, because I remembered he had been there some years ago, and I sent a message saying, hey, if there's anything that you got from there, just at least remember and thank. And then this gentleman came in for lunch, and he came in and he started talking about Kamakhya and his experience. And he said, I'm a Sri Ravi Shankar follower. I've never ever been into the idea of Tantra and Mantra. But there I was in the midst of this celebration of Kamakhya, etc. And then some priest called him while he was sitting here and said, this is the best time to be able to do a puja around the idea of any legal thing, because one of the Ma Kamakhyas lieutenants is the person you pray to for legal recourse, for example. And I'm like, how interesting. It's not something that, I have an affinity for necessarily. It's not that I don't believe, but I've never necessarily engaged with it. So yes, I didn't necessarily change my mind, but I certainly opened my mind to this idea of other beings and stuff and so on and so forth. So it's interesting. So, at the end of the day, because, I'm a reader, I read all the time. And when you come across deep philosophical insight, it doesn't necessarily help you change your mind, but it opens up your mind to other possibilities. And, I've never been somebody with a great rigid mindset. Yes, I have a rigid mindset when it comes to anything to do with discrimination, especially when it's based on religion or caste or color or nationality, and violence and hatred around us. I have a particular kind of rigid stance, which is none of this should be acceptable and all of this should be something you fight against. But barring that, as a liberal, you are defined by the idea of being able to navigate and change. And I think therein lies the problem with liberalism, that all of us have this one degree of difference from each other and therefore don't stand together. Whereas on the right of center, their narrative is so strong and so didactic that they tend to speak with one voice. Whereas if you have a liberal penchant or a liberal way of thinking, you navigate. You're like a river. You make a left, you make a right, you sometimes flow backwards. And that's the idea of liberalism, as opposed to, the idea of being didactic in your thought.